Okay. Now, 2 Samuel basically ends its account of the census incident and the plague that followed with the purchase of the threshing floor and the offering of sacrifices, and just kind of ends it there. Its last verse, specifically, the last sentence, at least in English, is, "Then the Lord answered prayer in behalf of the land, and the plague in Israel was stopped." Then that's the end of 2 Samuel, and we go right on into 1 Kings, and 1 Kings 1 says, when David was old and well advanced in years, blah, 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 blah. We're not getting into that now. 2 Chronicles, however, has quite a bit of more information to cover after the plague in the land was stopped. That happens in chapter 21. 1 Chronicles, goes on into chapter 29. So there are several chapters left in 1 Chronicles that cover the fallout of the census incident and the purchasing of the threshing floor of Aruanah the Jebusite by King David. I am not entirely certain why the writer of Samuel did not see fit to include the information that comes after the plague is over, which the chronicler obviously did. It's very important information because this is where the temple is going to be built. This story is here. As I've said many times, it's always a fair question to ask when we read anything in the Bible about why this particular piece of information was included, whether it's a list of genealogies or a prophecy or a poem or a narrative. It's always worth asking ourselves, like, why is this information included? The Bible covers so many years, and there's so much information that isn't included. So, like, why does the information that didn't make it in? That's a good question to ask. In both cases, Samuel and Chronicles, we're seeing the purchase of the site where the temple will be built. For some reason, only Chronicles goes on to actually detail the preparations being made for the temple to be built on this site. The writer of Samuel just did not include that information, did not see fit to write that down. Maybe the writer of Samuel assumed that his entire audience at that time knew already that was the site where the temple was built. You have to remember again, Chronicles is being written hundreds of years after Samuel and Kings. Okay, Samuel and Kings themselves are being written down after the fact, or compiled at least into the documents that we now have after the fact. But Chronicles is coming along even after that. Chronicles is being written sometime around 400-ish BC or in the late 400s BC. And Samuel and Kings would go back 300 plus years before that, at least, if not even more. Well, Samuel would at least. So the chronicler is aware of Samuel and Kings in a way that Samuel and Kings is not aware of Chronicles, because Chronicles did not exist yet when Samuel and Kings were being written. And the chronicler clearly has access to information that still existed in his day that has long since been lost to us since. I mean, the chronicler may be more recent than Samuel and Kings, but he's still 400 years BC. 400 BC, 2,400 years ago from our own time. So even though he's coming along 400, 300, who knows, years after Samuel and Kings, he's still 2,400 or so years beyond our own time. So he has access to stories and documents and traditions that we don't have access to. And he is aware of Samuel and Kings. I think we'll even mention these documents, at least in an offhanded way, as we go on. And so he is filling in some blanks here that apparently the writer of Samuel just felt that his audience already knew. The writer of Samuel and Kings apparently assumed that their audience at that time, the Israelites of the day in which those books were first written, already knew the story of the threshing floor becoming the site of the temple. Also, you have to remember that the writers of Samuel, and especially Kings, were more focused ultimately on the failures of the Israelite kings and their successes. We don't see a lot of this in Samuel. I mean, we see it with Saul. And even with David, the second half of 2 Samuel is all about David's failures. And the Kings, of course, the books of the Kings are going to be focused very much on the failures of the Kings rather than the successes. Chronicles doesn't go that way. Chronicles will mention the failures of the Kings sometimes. Actually, by and large, they kind of Chronicles just doesn't even mention some of the failures of the Kings. Like, we didn't read about David's incident with Bathsheba or any of the fallout that happened with his family after. That's not even mentioned in Chronicles. Chronicles is more concerned with pointing out the king's successes. Okay, the chronicler is focused on the good part of the covenant with God that God made with the kings, and showing that God is still faithful to that covenant, even though in the land as they are right now, 400 or so BC, they don't have a king. So the chronicler is interested in uplifting the spirits of the Israelites, whereas the writer of Samuel and Kings is determined to show us why they fell, why the kingdom fell. So part of it may be simply because the writer of Samuel and Kings is simply more interested in recording the failures of the kings rather than their successes. Or maybe they just figured that the Israelites at the time that they were writing knew the story of the threshing floor. Whatever the reason, Samuel does not go into detail about anything about the preparations David made to build the temple. But Chronicles does. It's because we have this information in Chronicles that we know that David did all this. We can see the connection here. I mean, ultimately, the reason why the information is not in 2 Samuel is because the Holy Spirit who inspired these men to write this stuff, knew that eventually he would be including it in this book here, the First Chronicles. I mean, ultimately, that's the reason. But if we try to think about it from the perspective of why these anonymous human men who wrote these books and compiled it in this way, why the chronicler mentioned this and the previous authors didn't, like that's the way I see it is why that is that way. Okay, so now we're starting up at the end of chapter 21 in First Chronicles. We're going to be in First Chronicles now for the rest of this account. Chapter 21, verse 29. David has finished offering sacrifices to the Lord on the threshing floor of Aruanah the Jebusite. The tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses had made in the desert, and the altar of burnt offering were at that time at the high place at Gibeon. They've been there for a while. Shiloh was the place the tabernacle had been located for most of the interim between their arrival in the Promised Land and the days of Eli, the high priest, at the beginning of 1 Samuel. But the Philistines overran it and either destroyed it or caused the Israelites to retreat from there and dismantle it and take it, at least take part of it. Anyway, Shiloh is gone. Shiloh has been abandoned, possibly destroyed or overrun. And so whatever is left of the tabernacle was reassembled apparently at Gibeon. But it needs to be in Jerusalem. The tabernacle and the ark need to be together. They're meant to go together. The tabernacle is meant to be the dwelling place of the ark hasn't been, okay, so Shiloh was sacked, we don't really know what happened at Shiloh, actually. The Bible itself doesn't lay out the fate of Shiloh clearly, but clearly something bad happened to it. We do read in 1 Samuel, the Philistines overran, the Israelites lost decisively to them, they lost the Ark of the Covenant. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were dead, were killed in this battle. When he heard the news, Eli himself died, and then one of the brothers' wives gave birth and died because of the distress of hearing all this stuff. And the ark was captured. It remained in Philistine custody. And then even after they got it back, even after the Philistines sent it back, the Israelites didn't even go get it back. The Philistines sent it back. They put it in another place for 20 years. And David finally went to go get it and ultimately brought it to Jerusalem. But the tabernacle was still in Gibeon. Now this was a compromise solution because David had two high priests at this time. He had Zadok, who was of the line of Eleazar, who was the actual legitimate high priest, and he had Abiathar, who was the line of Ithamar, who was not actually a legitimate high priest, but who had been a friend to David and whose family had been destroyed and slaughtered because of David's mistake in going, there was a whole priest. You remember the city at Nob? David went there after he fled Saul. There was a servant of Saul there who knew David was there, and he informed on that to Saul later on. And then Saul summoned the priests and had this guy, this spy, this informant, Doeg the Edomite, killed them all. The one escaped, and that was Abiathar, so David, they're allies. David and Abiathar are allies, and David feels a sort of responsibility for what happened to the priests of Abiathar's clan. So David doesn't really feel like he can, even though Abiathar is not the legitimate high priest, David probably doesn't feel like he can actually get him to step down because of the connection that they have together. So Zadok is the official legitimate high priest, and he's functioning in one place. And Abiathar is functioning as a high priest in another place. And this is not the way it's actually supposed to be. This is just kind of the way it is for political purposes more than anything right now. But it's not the way it's actually supposed to be. The tabernacle and the ark are supposed to be together as one unit, as one worship site. And there's supposed to be one. Now there's multiple priests. Okay? It's not there's only one priest. There's lots of priests. Abiathar and Zadok are both priests, but only Zadok is legitimately the high priest. And that situation will be rectified, but not until after David's time. David is not in a position to be able to fix this problem. But David, so the tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses had made in the desert, and the altar of burnt offering, so that's where the sacrifices should be taking place. The ark should be in the tabernacle. The ark is in Jerusalem. The altar is at the tabernacle, and that's where the sacrifices should be being offered. But David could not go before it to inquire of God, because he was afraid of the sword of the angel of the Lord. So he is offering his sacrifices at this altar he just built here in the threshing-floor, the former threshing-floor of Aruanah, the Jebusite, here in near Jerusalem. Then David said, "The house of the Lord God is to be here, and also the altar of burnt offering for Israel." So David is going to try to fix this problem of having two different worship sites by combining them and saying this is where it's going to be, right here. Not in his day, though, in his son's day. But we're going to have a resolution to this problem of having two different worship sites. We're going to bring them both together here, and it's going to be at this spot right here. So David gave orders to assemble the aliens living in Israel. And from among them, he appointed stone cutters to prepare dressed stone for building the house of God. So he is employing forced labor to get his temple ready. He can't build the temple itself, but he can do everything he can possibly do to get it ready. He provided a large amount of iron to make nails for the doors of the gateways and for the fittings, and more bronze than could be weighed. He also provided more cedar logs than could be counted, for the Sidonians and Tyrians had brought large numbers of them today. Remember, we read about King Hiram of Tyre a long time ago, being an ally of David. Let's see here. This was pretty early. Chapter 14, 1 Chronicles. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, along with cedar logs, stonemasons, and carpenters. So he already had a relationship. Now, Tyre is on the coast. It's up in the northern coast of Israel, as is Sidon. They are part of the Phoenician colonies. The Phoenicians were coastal people, similar to the Philistines, who were south of them. Apparently the Israelites did not have a problem with the Phoenicians, at least not at this point in time. They fought the Philistines endlessly for centuries. But apparently they were generally okay with the Phoenicians. Or the Phoenicians were okay with them, I'm not sure. And so the Phoenicians had access and control of the ports because they're on the coast. And they're apparently allied with David, and they've been sending David stuff for some time now already, and they're continuing to do so. The Sidonians and Tyrians had brought large numbers of these things to David, cedar logs to David. David said, "My son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the house to be built for the Lord should be of great magnificence and fame and splendor in the sight of all the nations. Therefore, I will make preparations for it." So David made extensive preparations before his death. I tend to think this is probably what he was doing, or what he was occupying himself with, for a good chunk of the latter part of his reign, which probably explains why he seems to have become withdrawn from the public life during this time. This is probably going on while the Absalom stuff is unfolding. All these preparations he's making is probably stuff that he's doing during that period of time where the Absalom stuff is unfolding. At least to some degree. These two periods of time probably overlap at least to some degree. Then he called for his son Solomon. At some point after all this, then he calls for his son Solomon and charged him to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, "My son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But this word of the Lord came to me. You have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight." He shed a lot of blood. David has shed a lot of blood. I'm not sure if all of it was justified either. Most of it would have been. Most of it was done in the name of holy war. But some of it might not have been. Okay, some of that blood David shed might not have been. I mean, Uriah's blood certainly wasn't. Now, David made this an offer to God. We read about this in 2 Samuel 7. And in 2 Samuel, we don't actually get the reason why God says no to David. He says no to David, but he says yes to David's son. 2 Samuel doesn't provide us with a reason why he says no to David. 1 Chronicles does. It said it earlier, and it says it here again. God said no to David because David's reputation had already become too associated with bloodshed at that time. Solomon will be a man of peace. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon. So this is probably before he even had Solomon. David's offer to make God a house, which is what God responded to, is recorded at least before his sin with Bathsheba. So at this point in time, when he gets this word from God, he may not even have Solomon yet. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name. He will be my son, and I will be his father. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever, even in the days of the chronicler, when there is no king sitting on the throne in Israel. The throne of Solomon and David will be established, regardless of whether or not there is a human king sitting on the throne at any given time. Now, my son, David is speaking to Solomon again here, the Lord be with you, and may you have success and build the house of the Lord your God as he said you would. May the Lord give you discretion and understanding when he puts you in command over Israel, so that you may keep the law of the Lord your God. Then you will have success if you are careful. If you are careful. If. There's that if again. There's always an if. Always an if. God's love is unconditional, but our receiving his promises is conditional on that if. Then you will have success if you are careful to observe the decrees and laws that the Lord gave Moses for Israel. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged. I have taken great pains to provide for the temple of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, quantities of bronze and iron too great to be weighed, and wood and stone. And you may add to them. You have many workmen, stonecutters, masons, and carpenters, as well as men skilled in every kind of work, in gold and silver, bronze and iron, craftsmen beyond number. Now begin the work, and the Lord be with you. We read about that back in Exodus, didn't we? All these craftsmen and skilled workers who were supposed to help make the stuff that went with the tabernacle. Then David ordered all the leaders of Israel to help his son Solomon. He said to them, Is not the Lord your God with you? And has he not granted you rest on every side? For he has handed in, and one day it'll be terror on every side. There's going to come a point in time in the days of Jeremiah when they're going to have terror on every side. But today, In the latter days of David and in the beginning and throughout Solomon, for the most part, throughout Solomon's reign, they have rest on it. I would much rather have rest on every side than terror on every side. Has he not granted you rest on every side? For he has handed the inhabitants of the land over to me, and the land is subject to the Lord and to his people, in a way that it never will be again. From this generation onward, actually from the generation of Solomon afterwards, onward, every Hebrew, every Israelite, every Jew, every child of Jehovah, every child of this covenant, is going to look back from whenever they live in Rehoboam's time. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, or Jeremiah's time, or Habakkuk's time, or Zechariah's time, or even Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, when they would have been alive in the days of Jesus, when Jesus begins his ministry. It's like everyone at that time would have been looking back on that era of David and Solomon, in which I wish this was that way again still. I wish we had rest on every side, and the land was subject to the Lord and to his people. That's the environment that Jesus is born into. That's the environment that exists at the time of the Gospels, when Jesus' ministry unfolds. Everyone that Jesus would have been speaking to during his ministry, all of his disciples, all of his crowds, all of the religious leaders, everyone in Israel would have looked back at this time when all the land was subject to Israel, and wants that to be true again. Now devote your heart and soul to seeking the Lord your God. Begin to build the sanctuary of the Lord God, so you may bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord and the sacred articles belonging to God into the temple that will be built for the name of the Lord.